So, hello and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us, Kendall. How are you?
Doing well, yeah. Excited to be here.
Yeah, we are so happy that you're here. And Kendall and I know each other along with Sapna from working together here in Austin, Texas. And for those of you that don't know us, my name is Mandy Rourke, and I am one of the co-founders of Zesho. And I also have my fellow co-founder here for a brief introduction.
Yes, I am Stefna Srivastav, also, as Mandy said, co-founder of Zesho, and currently a registered marriage and family therapy intern, residing in from Austin, Texas as well. And so we're so excited to have you here, Kendall. Why don't we let you introduce yourself, maybe share a little bit of where you're from as far as your education goes, where you're from originally, if you feel comfortable sharing that, how long you've been practicing, where you're practicing, those fun details.
Yeah, sure. So my name is Kendall Campbell. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist in Austin, Texas. I'm a native Texan, grew up in Fort Worth area, and then basically traversed down I-35 my whole life. So started in undergrad at Baylor in Waco, and did my undergraduate in psychology there. Worked at a couple of psych centers at Waco Center for Youth, working with teens. Kind of started my career there, and then traversed down into Austin to attend St. Edward's University for my Master's of Arts in Counseling. I started that journey in 2012, I believe it was, and then started or opened my practice in 2015 and have been working as a private practitioner basically since then.
Awesome. I like that. Going south down 35. And
Yep,
here
pretty
we are
much.
in Austin, Texas.
Yeah.
And we
We
stop there.
yeah,
Yeah.
that's where we'll stay.
Yep.
So just to kind of set the tone for our conversation today, all of us here together share, I think, in the passion of just being lifelong learners. And we wanted to take the opportunity to have a conversation with you as one of the experts in the field and talk a little bit more about your specialty, but then also give our audience just a chance to have some really helpful takeaways from a wonderful therapist who helps people on the daily. It gives you an opportunity to expand your reach so that, maybe some people that you wouldn't get to see can hear a little bit about um, all the things that you do to help. So that's what we'll be starting with today.
Yeah. Sounds like a plan.
So to get started with that, we figured we'd ask you, and Mandy and I have an idea from our previous conversations together of what your specialties are, but we figured you could introduce it in your own words and kind of share what your focusi are in therapy and your practice.
Yeah, of course. So I primarily work with couples. I work with couples specializing in one of two areas, or typically sometimes it involves both. But I work with addiction and or infidelity, right? Um, those are the two specializations that I've been working with for about 7-ish years now. When I first started my practice, I basically spent that first year pretty much trying to figure out what type of demographic I wanted to work with. That happened to be couples. And then pretty much the couples that were walking into my office just by happenstance were couples dealing with one of these two things. I didn't have, outside of just the schooling education, I didn't have a whole bunch of expertise in either of those areas. And so I did what most therapists tend to do. I researched, I read books, I asked other professionals, and then I actually ended up, to further my experience and my expertise, I worked at a treatment center called, well, I won't mention the name for their confidentiality, but I worked at a treatment center as a lead therapist for some time, for about a year and a half, and basically just tried to bolster my experience there. I got to work with individuals, their families, do weekend workshops with them to help understand addiction cycle, and kind of how it impacts not just the individual, not just even the relationship, but everyone around it.
Mhm. That's such a solid experience. And I think that as we were thinking about meeting with you today, we're like, we just want to pick your brain. We want to help, others just learn from the things that you learned from. Just, I know that experience in itself was probably so incredibly helpful for you as a clinician, and just kind of understanding addiction better. And so we have a couple specialties here, though, relationships and also addiction. And, both of those two combined. So today, maybe we start with just part one and understanding and getting just a little bit more tips and tricks that you have up your sleeve around addiction. And then everyone will just need to stay tuned for our second part of the conversation when we can get into some of your expertise around infidelity and just experience there. So
yeah, that works.
Yeah. Where do we begin?
Well, maybe we can begin with a little more broad. Of how would you describe addiction or define it, just for the sake of clarity to get everyone kind of on the same page as we continue this conversation?
Yeah, so it's a perfect first question because addiction is so broad, and especially in our modern era, we define it in a variety of different ways, right? So broad terms, most people think of addiction in terms of substance use, right? Alcohol, and or drugs, right? We have a big opioid crisis and benzo crisis in our world right now, especially in our nation. So that's kind of where most people tend to focus. And we also have other things like process addictions, gambling, sex, TV, food, things of that nature. And those are all various forms of addiction. At its core, whenever I'm working with people that are dealing with this, that either identify it as formal addiction or just viewing it as problematic, it's something that's extended beyond the realm of their control, right? I think a lot of people are probably more accustomed to this as of 2 years ago when the pandemic hit and they found themselves in a more confined or isolated space, engaging in things that maybe were normal and natural, and they kind of elevated, right? We did this with TV, we did this with food, we did this with alcohol, especially. Then whenever things started to kind of return to a sense of normal, readjusting that definition of what is tolerable or manageable kind of was thrown out of sorts, right? So when we are engaging in something that is a little bit beyond our control, when we attempt to stop it unsuccessfully numerous times, and when especially it starts to impact other areas of our lives, beyond just ourselves, our relationships, our education, our occupation, things like that, that's whenever we start to inch towards that formal diagnosis of addiction.
Beautiful. I think you encompassed about 5 of our questions all in one, and I love it. That doesn't mean I'm not going to claw into some more of that.
Yeah, no worries.
That was amazing. And so I think my next question, given you touched on it already here, as we said, which I love, that people who might categorize addiction as a problem or just wanting help with it, support with it, once they realize it's something that they can't control or they've tried stopping and they aren't successful. Is there anything else that you would add to how people can start to maybe recognize that this might be an actual problem? How can they maybe start to be a little more intentional in looking for those signs if it hasn't been something that they've been thinking about to begin with? And I think maybe there's a quote that you shared with me before from Glennon Doyle. Is that who it is? You know the one I'm talking about?
And I think this is something that a lot of clients have brought up in session before, where they're scrolling their Instagram feeds and they see Glennon Doyle, who is, she's a queen, she's amazing, and she also really honors the sober lifestyle. And one thing that she posted was, if you're thinking about, do I have a problem a lot, and you keep finding yourself thinking about that problem, let me just cut to the chase. You do have a problem. And that's a lot of people have, had that same experience. And I'm just curious about, what else you'd offer around how it's like it really is becoming a problem. The focus of, it's outside of our control, but also like this is no longer fitting for, a healthy or happy life.
Yeah, it's well put that. There is this spectrum to some extent of problem all the way to addiction, right? When you recognize that there's some sort of issue, right? You can make attempts to change it. You can curb it. I mean, we experience this a lot around the new year when everyone sets their New Year's resolutions. There's recognition in that moment about desire to change something, nutrition, health, whatever, social interaction, and you make attempts. Those attempts sometimes work, a lot of times don't because of any number of different factors, burning yourself out, overthinking it, not doing enough research, whatever else it is. When we talk about recognition of something that's addiction level, the concept of the problem is unmanageable. You can make 1,000 attempts, and 1,000 attempts, it's not going to pan out, not for lack of trying, not for lack of desire, but because it takes something bigger than yourself, right? There's, not to get too much into it, but most people, whenever they associate or whenever they think about addiction, they think about AA or Alcoholics Anonymous, right? And there's every manner of offshoot of that, Narcotics Anonymous, Sexual Addiction Anonymous, right? Those types of communities are essentially built on having a support system to not only call attention to the unmanageability of the specific problem, but to help you through something that might be beyond just yourself, right? And whether you subscribe to the 12 steps, which is the AA model of thinking and working through, or not, the concept of a community in that and helping you move through that is really the key point there.
That's a huge point, because I think as you were just talking about that, I was like, it could also just be asking for help from a professional too, to know even where to begin in that process, because like we start, a lot of people recognize, okay, this is unmanageable. And I like that a couple of key things that you're saying, that this is beyond my control. Like I'm unable to manage things I try aren't solutions. It's just more of the same. And I think sometimes it can be overwhelming for people to know, okay, now I know that this isn't working and I can't manage it. Who is the person, or who are the people outside of myself that can help me? When some of those people may be family or friends who have been really impacted by this challenge.
Yeah, it's a bit unfortunate, but a lot of times, and I think it's a tendency of a lot of different problems, but we become aware of problems. We move into this contemplative stage when others bring it to our attention, right? Addiction, substance use, processing addictions are really similar in that respect. It is one of those things that we view, this is the time where comparison can be actually a healthy thing, where if I'm drinking, for example, 2 bottles or 3 bottles of beer a day versus the person next to me is drinking 1 versus the person next to them is drinking 9, I don't really know what's healthy or normal because everyone is to some extent drinking, right? I can compare myself and say, well, I'm not drinking as much as them, but I'm drinking more than them. And there's not really an understood version of it being problematic, right? Especially if that's part of the culture or the environment you're in, that's normal. But the second we kind of escape that culture or the environment, or the second that we start to realize that it's impacting areas that we're unaware of, relationships being a big one. My partner says, I don't feel as connected to you, or I don't feel like we have the same type of conversations that we used to, or I feel like there's a difference whenever you're sober versus when you're not, right? That's whenever those problems really kind of come from underneath the surface and we can really begin to address them. And that's where having, again, community support, like an AA or some sort of support group, or a clinician who's has the expertise and who's trained to help you normalize and help you recognize, hey, there is a difference between what the standards are and what is specifically healthy for you and your body versus what you believe is normal.
Yeah, I love that there's different aspects that you touched on there of like being able to recognize it kind of yourself and the differences that you notice and the difficulty that you have and maybe changing that behavior yourself, as well as kind of using the scale a little bit to a degree of, this my behavior might be different from other people's in this regard,
Yeah.
or noticing that if I'm drinking this much, but it affects me so much more than it seems to the other people around me, or doesn't affect me for that matter,
Yeah.
because there's tolerance, as well as recognizing how it's impacting your relationships. If your partner is bringing up certain factors that they're noticing, other family members, friends, for that matter,
Hmm.
it's important to kind of take all of those into account and kind of just zoom out a little bit, see if you can see that bigger picture. And I'm also hearing that um, that emphasis on like you are not alone in this. Like it's not because there's lack of trying, but because this is bigger than you and you don't have to do it by yourself. So being able to turn to a community, to a professional, as
Hmm.
well as getting the support of your loved ones would be important in this way. But I'm also curious, kind of on the flip side, um, you know, what about in scenarios where maybe a family member, a loved one, a friend might be the one who's noticing these signs before the person who's actually dealing with addiction?
Yeah.
um, what might you say to them? What have you said to them maybe, of how they can be supportive in that circumstance?
Yeah. It's a really good question. It's something that a lot of when I'm getting the referrals and when I get phone calls, a lot of times it is from the significant other, the family member of the person that is either in use or an active addiction or some form or fashion of that. Um, this is where the relational component comes in. When we work with relationships as marriage and family therapists, we talk about the overarching thing of communication and vulnerability and trust and all of that. And these are one of those times, or this is one of those times where we really have to capitalize on that. So a lot of times what I try and assess and what I try and figure out is, has that person had that conversation or attempted to have that conversation before, right? Obviously, the answer is going to vary depending on if they've tried this 15 times or 30 times, then I'm going to maybe choose a little bit more of a direct route. We might have to start talking about holding boundaries, and maybe to the extent of ultimatums, right? Not my favorite route, but sometimes that's kind of what we need to do, consequence in order to kind of shift perspective or draw attention to where we need it to. Versus if the person is this is the first time they're recognizing it, that was more of that was more of the experience, especially over the course of the pandemic, when people realized, yeah, I went through quite a bit of alcohol or whatever it was over that course of that week without really realizing it, and my partner was aware of it, so on and so forth. In those instances, it's simply about prompting your partner, hey, I want to be able to have a conversation, and mind you, I'm going to use my boring, jargony, clinically talk for a second. And I tell clients this all the time. The idea is to convert it to your own language. You're going to say it however you're going to say it, but the themes within it that I point out are really the key points, right? So letting your partner know that you want to have a conversation in some capacity, right? So that they don't feel blindsided. So they don't feel blindsided. If you can even um, comment on what specifically you'd like to talk about, right? I want to talk about our general health, right? Keeping it broad, much like some couples would talk about, hey, I want to talk about our finances or I want to talk about our future, right? You might get a groan or something like that, especially if it's not typical communication within the relationship, but it prompts and sets the stage for that conversation. Then we shift to focusing on the individual's experience, in this case, the partner's experience, right? As therapists, it's going to sound a bit cliche, but it's incredibly important here. Talking and sharing your specific feelings, right? Hey, I feel as if I've observed X, Y, and Z, and those actions or those observations have impacted me in this way, right? This is where a lot of times in people, whenever they call me up, they'll naturally say these things. And if we could just encapsulate that, record that, and have that be shown to their partner, they would know exactly what to say because they already said it to me. These are the comments like, I've been noticing over the past week or month that my partner keeps coming home and I don't feel connected to him, right? I try and have a conversation and it's met with maybe later, or I'm going to grab a beer or something like that. And I'm starting to feel disconnected. I'm starting to feel hurt. I'm starting to feel unheard or unseen. Those are the types of emotions that I want and experiences I want that partner to be able to convey. Those are challenging emotions. They're big emotions. And it's going to be difficult for that person to necessarily take on all of that at once. So rather than what we call kitchen sinking, throwing all of it on the person at once, I recommend, and we talk about highlighting one specific thing. If you feel unheard, stick with that. Focus on how one or your experience of several observations have impacted or created the experience of you feeling unheard or unseen or whatever it may be. And let that be the dialogue that starts what will be many dialogues from that.
As you were saying this, I mean, I just think about so many conversations that I've had with clients and just, sharing with the overwhelm that they experience. And it's just once you're in that very fearful, disconnected state, it can be a very emotionally trying place to be able to clear your thoughts, to be able to have those conversations. So I think that as you were just describing it, like this is kind of part one. All right, part two, part three, and all of it is like very intentional about your self-reflections, your self-needs, and your experience that you're having, that obviously you want your partner to just hear first and then not just kind of bombard into this major confrontation, which many people aren't really comfortable with from the start anyways. It's too heavy. That's just adding to the heaviness, adding to the overwhelm.
It is. I mean, this is one of the challenges with mental health in general, is that nobody likes discomfort. And to ask someone to then experience discomfort and then walk into a heavier, thicker version of it, it's scary, it's discomforting. I don't want to do that, right? I think one of the biggest challenges and the thing that, I always have to kind of be a champion and kind of a cheerleader for clients is reminding them that these conversations, one, don't always have to have a solution. Sometimes, especially when it comes to things like addiction, you have to sit in the space. When we talk about therapists, we sit in the space about recognizing that there may not be a formal solution in the moment, but cultivating understanding, right? I want to know, or I want to understand why you feel what you feel, or how you think what you think, or how you've acted, or what created that action. That's huge. So knowing that there doesn't have to be a solution is critical. And then beyond that, knowing that nothing is going to be solved, or very, very, very rarely is anything going to be solved in one conversation, right? Maybe if we're talking, I'm hungry, then I can go to the fridge and I grab food. Sure, simple enough. But we're obviously talking about something more in depth than that. Mm-hmm. And I think that a lot of times gives people a little bit of a buffer, a little bit more of a reprieve, so they don't have to go in trying to solve the problem like that.
Yeah. I like that, because that gives that permission and that pressure to kind of roll off a little bit and just focus on like that next step forward in front of you of stepping one foot further into that heavier, thicker version of that discomfort. And I appreciate how you describe that, because that is exactly what it feels like oftentimes. And especially for, some people who are not necessarily accustomed to having those kinds of conversations, or if those heavier conversations are just inherently anxiety provoking, which I think it tends to be for a mass majority of people, I'd imagine.
Yep, humans.
Yes, right, exactly, those, including therapists oftentimes.
Completely.
If not constantly. Yeah, I definitely think that's a really helpful piece for people to consider, and also recognizing, like, again, like this help might be much bigger than you and the person that you care about who may be dealing with addiction at the time. And so what would you say are like options. So for anyone who, is willing to have this conversation, maybe have started to have this conversation with, their loved ones, or they themselves recognizing like there's a problem here and I do need help.
Yeah.
I know you've touched on a couple so far, but like just kind of making it a little more clear, like what are the different resources, supports, options that people commonly and can have the option to pursue when they are ready to look for that help.
Yeah. So this is one that I think stifles so many people at that first step. It can be incredibly overwhelming because it's a blessing and a curse. There are so many different options and there's so many different tiers or levels of care. And I think much like you wouldn't most likely, most people tend to go to professionals to help and assist them in some manner, right? I'm not an accountant, so I don't try and do my own taxes because I would fail miserably at doing my own taxes, right? They're going to look at the all the tax law and know all of that stuff for me, right? So having a professional like myself, or even someone, it doesn't have to be formal proper therapy, but someone who's acquainted with the field, leaning in on them first, utilizing them as a support system to help you quickly determine kind of the severity of what your experience is, right? Again, like we mentioned in the very beginning, addiction is one of those things that gets thrown around so often and so frequently that we tend to, as our natural human brains do, whenever I think I have a problem, it's not just a problem, it's the worst problem beyond all belief, right? It's the WebMD experience, right? I have cancer, I have whatever else it is. The reality is probably not. It is probably something that you have awareness of, and that it's just kind of drudging up some things. And a brief stint in therapy might help drudge up some other things that help you realize and adjust that behavior, whatever the behavior is, right? On the off chance that it might be more that where you fall on the spectrum of support and help needs to be a little more, there are three big nodes or modules, right? At the lowest, it's community support, right? These are things like, it can be like AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, or whatever substance that you're leaning into. They have, again, offshoots of all of those. This doesn't have to be AA. There's things like Smart Recovery. There's things like Refuge Recovery. The concept of those is the community support system, peers, people who share or have the capacity to share experiences like you've had, to support you in that fashion. AA, like I said, is one of the bigger ones. The structure there is that you not only have community, but you also have a mentor, a sponsor, as they call it, to help guide you, someone who has expertise, someone who has months or years or decades of time to support you in that manner. For a lot of people, that is enough. That's what they're looking for. That's what they need. They take what they need, and then they continue on their merry lives, right? For others, where the process of the disease is a little more unmanageable, we have things like IOP. That would technically be the next step. It's called an intensive outpatient program, right? It's a little more formal. Typically, average IOPs are about 10 hours a week of therapy. They're comprised of generally three days of group sessions that are about 3 hours long, and then 1 hour of individual therapy. So you kind of get a little combination of both. You get that support system, the difference being that it's led by a professional or professionals to help guide the conversation, to help you maybe even lean into deeper or harder topics that you might not feel comfortable doing with just another peer. You have that again 3 times a week, and then you have that individual therapy to lean in on things that were brought up in group or to discuss anything else, right? Those IOPs, intensive outpatient programs, they can last anywhere between 30 days, 60 days, 6 sessions, 9 sessions. There's a lot of variability with that. And again, that's kind of dependent on where the client is at, where the individual is at. For those that are needing a higher level of care than that, that's where we come into what we call partial hospitalization programs, PHPs. Those are somewhat as they sound. Those are much longer, more intensive. Think of it becomes a full-time job. You're at a location from 8 to 5, give or take. You engage in a myriad of curriculum, from drug and alcohol awareness. Strictly speaking, I should say, from a drug and alcohol rehab center, you'll engage in curriculum about drug and alcohol awareness, around cessation, around providing you community support, and then there's therapy. So it's a combination of group therapy and individual therapy, and then that community. It's just more intensive in that it's longer and more contained, right? The most intense, the highest level of care is residential and PHP. It's a combination of what I just described, but you're also staying at a facility, right? Or a location nearby. This seems like the most extreme route. There's a lot of pros to it in that you have a community of people that you get to bond with, share with, experience the entire time. You quite literally create your mini microculture, right? It's huge. In some instances, or in the experience that I get from many, it feels like the world for you stops. You're somewhat unburdened. It's kind of like going on vacation, though not the most fun vacation. You're unburdened by a lot of different things. You don't typically think about work or anything else. You're just focused on an isolated topic, your health, your well-being, right? Those things are typical. Those PHPs are typically 30 days, 60 days, sometimes 90 days, right? So they can go depending on the severity and what you're looking for and what you're needing. The added benefit with PHP programs and residential programs is many of them tie in a family component. So for those that are unaware of what addiction is, they're unfamiliar with it, they have no definition, they have no experience of it, nothing like that. We bring families in, we share with them very similar education that we provide people coming into treatment with, highlight for them the addiction cycle, how it impacts their relationships. And then every treatment center has their own unique flair with this, but there's a lot of interventions, what we call psychodramas, or times in which the individual's experience addiction gets to really play out or express the impact that addiction has had on them, as well as their partner or their family gets to express the impact it's had on them, right? So when you have more time, when you're in a more intensive program, there's a lot more tools and tips and tricks that can be incorporated in that time. That's kind of the gradient of things. And already it can be a little overwhelming. I can even hear my own self talking about in long detail. And that's sort of half the equation, right? The other half is once you leave, then there's a whole nother gamut. And that's when we talk about things like sober living, or having supportive recovery coaches on the back end, people to help that gradual transition back into reality life world as we know it, right? As I mentioned, most people feel or have the experience that the world kind of stops for them. For everyone on the outside, not so much, right? And so having people work hand in hand, be it a coach or a sponsor or something like that, or a therapist in this case, to help guide and have those subtle transitions so that while the families on the outside, the world has been turning from them, they can begin to understand and appreciate what's been going on the inside for this other person. Radical change can occur, but if you've been the person that's been hurt on the outside, it's difficult to do that. You're still met with what you experienced prior to the person going in, right? So there's a lot there. And if you take away nothing, hopefully you can take away that just me sharing this can be overwhelming. And that's why having a professional like myself can make things a little easier.
Yeah, absolutely. And I have to jump in here, Manny, because this was super, super just enlightening, I think, of having it laid out in such a clear way. And in the progression, I think, yes, it's a lot. It's certainly a lot, but it's also really helpful to hear like what the different options are and who at what level can benefit most from those different options.
Yeah.
And it sounds like, kind of going back to our first step that we can focus on taking next, that finding a professional, whether it's in your community, in your network, or someone that you set up an appointment with, who might be able to kind of help set you up with, like, it sounds like maybe this resource might be the best fit. I can share, specific referrals. We use the word referrals, specific places you can go, or people you can talk to. In that way, is that what you kind of would recommend, or are there other things that you would recommend as like that first baby step that someone could take in this situation?
Yeah, completely. And the nice thing, so obviously we're speaking from being in Austin or the greater Austin area, and we have a bit of the luxury of Austin is a huge, huge recovery hotspot and community. And so not only do we have quite a few resources and amenities for people that are in the position of addiction, we have quite a few people from all around the country actually coming to Austin for these specific treatments, for these specific centers. Most, if not all, treatment centers have a screening process. They will be, and they're run by people who are professionals, and they're run by people, a lot of times, but not always, people who are professionals, but also in recovery themselves. So their goal, their job is to ensure that you have the right fit, right? If they will assess for everything from trauma to upbringing to anything and everything. Honestly, it's a bit cumbersome in the sense of you'll be there for a minute because they want to make sure that what you're seeking is what they're going to match you with the best fit for that. So there are programs exclusively for men. There are programs exclusively for women, for children or adolescents, really. There are programs that have that are outdoors or more in urban environments or city environments. There's any manner and combination of what you could look for. And so that's why having someone who has that expertise or who can point you to those recommendations or referral sources is really, really key.
That's everything that you're saying is key, honestly, Kendall,
Yeah.
because this is such an incredible, valuable resource just in our conversation alone today. And I'm just so grateful that we had the time to talk with you. I mean, you've shared so much about the individual experience from just being able to identify, like, how do I even handle this big question of, is this a problem? Is this not? How do I gauge that? But then also, after understanding how you gauge the problem, what to do with that.
Yeah.
And I think what feels really good as a starting point is just to know that first, you're not alone and that there's not an immediate solution. And so we just kind of hold space to figure it out. And I just am so thankful that you gave so much examples of how you would work with someone in the seat with those questions. So thank you for your time. And I know that we have so much more to discuss with you with your other specialty with infidelity. So we'll definitely look forward to continuing our conversation in a part 2 with Kendall Campbell from Austin, Texas, licensed marriage and family therapist. And just pass the mic over to y'all for any kind of closing words today.
Yeah, I really appreciate you taking the time, and I'm always happy to share more of my expertise and answer any questions that y'all have.
Yeah, this was so valuable, Kendall. Super, super appreciate it. I feel like I got a lot of clarity. I mean, obviously I'm familiar with a lot of this, but some of like the more specific details, it is a really involved process oftentimes, and there is a lot more details. And if you're not, fully enmeshed in that field, in that part of the world, then you don't always have that familiarity. So I really appreciate you sharing that with us and making
Yeah.
it accessible for the people who will benefit from that as well. So just in case, we're gonna hopefully we will be talking to you more soon about your additional specialty as well. But for those who've heard this and are like, very interested in learning more about you, about your work, what might be the best way that they can reach out to you, contact you, find you? Is it through your website, or are there any other places?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's definitely through my website, which is just simple as it's my name. So kendallcampbell.com. That gives you access to hopefully a myriad of resources to maybe help address a few additional questions you might have and help you begin to take some of those first steps. Has my contact information, my direct line, my phone number, my email, and then a portal for you if you feel the desire, if you have the desire to reach out and schedule a consultation or an appointment. You can do that all through that website.
Beautiful. And Kendall with 2 L's, correct?
2 L's. Yep.
Okay, great. Thank you, Kendall. We so
Awesome. Well,
appreciate
thank
it.
you, Kendall. We appreciate it. And we look forward to part 2 where we can pick your brain a little bit when it comes to infidelity. So we'll look forward to that.
Sounds like a plan. Talk soon.
All right. Bye-bye.